The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies. This episode, we're talking about journalism and documenting history in a galaxy far, far away. From the HoloNet to journalist Rhil Dairo from the new Rising Storm High Republic book. There's a lot to cover with our guest expert today, who is journalist, historian, and instructor at the University of South Florida, Chelsea Tatham Zukowski.
Star Warsologies is the podcast where we bring real-world science, technology, and other fields of study, and where it connects and intersects with the galaxy far, far away. I'm your host, James Floyd. I am a freelance writer for Star Wars Insider magazine and StarWars.com.
And I'm Melissa Miller. I'm also a freelance writer for Star Wars Insider magazine. My most recent piece was about virtual fandom and featured multiple podcasts from the Skywalking Network and included a feature on Force Fest, the awesome convention that they put on last summer. Let's get to the show. Thanks so much for being here, Chelsea.
Hi, thanks for having me. Really excited, and honored to be here. What you both do kind of parallels my interests, drawing connections between real world science and research and academics, and then connecting them with popular culture like Star Wars. So obviously I love Star Wars. So anytime I can connect my academic and historical work with Star Wars is a great day.
So it's great to have you here today. Chelsea is a freelance journalist. She's a writer for the Dork Side of the Force, which is maybe the best name for something ever. She's a historian, contributing editor of the Saber and Scroll Historical Journal, and an adjunct instructor of journalism and media studies at the University of South Florida. That's a whole bunch of stuff, Chelsea. Tell us a little bit about how you ended up in your career.
Yeah, when you list it all out, it does sound like a lot. But I started out as a print journalist and a copy editor. And I went to, did my undergrad in journalism and media studies, actually at University of South Florida. So I've returned now as an adjunct instructor, but I eventually kind of worked my way to being a television critic and an entertainment reporter at the local newspaper here in Tampa Bay, Florida. And then did some digital producing at a local television station. So now I'm also, a freelance writer, kind of covering some local features and nerd stuff, nerd news, of course, at Dork Side of the Force. And also I'm kind of a big space nerd. So I also cover space features and kind of connecting the space industry with pop culture as well for Supercluster.
Cool. That is a lot of stuff. We like all things geeky here at Star Warsology, so your space nerdery is definitely welcome. But here today, we're going to talk about journalism and history in Star Wars, and specifically how history gets recorded in the Star Wars galaxy. In the first movies, we don't really see the impact of journalism or the recording of history. Obviously, we know we have these big historical events that do need to be documented or propagandized in the case of the Empire and the Rebel Alliance. You want to talk about that a little bit? Why we see it in the more recent things, but not, back in the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, and what does that mean when we don't see it?
Well, when I think about, journalism and history kind of in Star Wars, I do think about kind of the newer examples, like in kind of the sequel trilogy, and even now with the High Republic, there's more notable examples of journalism and kind of like that recording of history. But I also think of the challenge of producing effective journalism for like an entire galaxy. I can't imagine trying to cover an entire galaxy. It's hard enough having even just a beat in kind of one county or one state or one country or, in one planet. You have the Star Wars galaxy, you have thousands of planets and systems, and they all have different types of government and politics. And then you have throughout kind of the Star Wars timeline, you have different forms of government for the galaxy in itself. So you start with the Republic, which is a democracy, I guess, with, senators representing each member system and planet, but then you think about each member system and each planet, they each have their own government and rulers. It just seems overwhelming to me. I cannot imagine being like a journalist trying to cover what the chancellor is doing. Like, I can't imagine being kind of during the Clone Wars and trying to cover the Clone Wars and what's Chancellor Palpatine doing and things like that. It just seems I can't even fathom what that would be like.
Well, I would imagine it would kind of be like how we have local news and national level news and international news, and there's different news organizations and reporters at all those levels, and the people who do the more in-depth stuff as opposed to the current what's happening headline news type stuff. But yeah, it's a big daunting task for consumers to make sense of it. What do they listen and watch or read about? And how much do these individual, governments that you talk about foster good journalism versus squelch down on journalism? Because you can imagine a lot of places that are more authoritarian or really only want their side of the news being reported, that they, aren't necessarily that friendly to free journalism.
Yeah, I feel like we definitely have lots of examples of that here on Earth, right? If you watch the local news where I am in San Diego, it's going to talk pretty much just about how whatever is happening is relevant to me in San Diego. And then, if you watch the national news, it's harder to identify. That's even farther away. So I'm trying to keep zooming out and think about if something was happening on another planet, much less in, the outer rim versus the central planets and stuff like that. It would be very hard to make that feel real, even in times of potentially, this galactic war that we see in Star Wars. So that's a good answer to the question. It's just that it's a big galaxy.
Yeah. And when I first started thinking about examples of journalism and journalists and historians in Star Wars, I really couldn't think of one solid example that stuck out to me. But then as I was doing my research to talk about this, I realized that it's kind of a good thing that there's not one character that really sticks out, since, I tell my students this now in kind of my lessons, the role of the journalist isn't supposed to be the focus of the story or the subject of the story. Journalists are supposed to be conduits for information for a society that's kind of constantly craving this free flow of information. And at least in Star Wars, I, of course, would love to see more examples of how the galaxy is covered, or even just on a planetary level or, kind of a regional level, how news and important things are reported to the people that really need to know about them and want to know about them. I think kind of the most notable example when you think of, what is the news look like in Star Wars, you think of the HoloNet, which is kind of referenced and seen briefly in several films and in the novels. But to me, the HoloNet kind of seems like more of a kind of social platform, like a social media type platform. And all the references I've seen, it seems like people can easily share stuff in there, share news, even though news reports still travel along that route. But I would like to see more stories about kind of how the HoloNet works.
Yeah, what are some examples? Yeah. I can't picture a scene that shows the HoloNet.
So I wrote down a few examples that I believe at least briefly reference a version of the HoloNet, if not in the name. So I'm currently reading Darth Plagueis, the Legends book, and there's a few passages where they reference journalists covering the Senate votes to welcome new Republic members during this time period. And then I'm also listening to Attack of the Clones, the audiobook. So in the beginning of the novel, and then obviously the beginning of the movie as well, there's the kind of major news event with the attempted assassination of Senator Amidala. I think there's kind of brief mentions of the news of that, even though it's more along the viewpoints of her and the Jedi and the other senators kind of talking about that news. But I can only imagine that news probably spread to at least everybody else in Coruscant. And then, of course, in the book Bloodline, there's kind of that huge revelation that Leia is related to Darth Vader. So I think there's some bits of information about coverage of that too.
Yeah. I think that with, in the novels and other stories, it's really easy to use journalism as an approach to getting information out to the reader, that it's like, okay, we'll use like a little news bulletin as a blurb to say, this is what the galaxy sees on this. So it gives a little snapshot, but then it helps easily get a lot of information to the reader. And then they can process it as the way the characters are processing it.
Yeah, it's definitely an exposition like trope, right, in movies and books as well. So it's a good way to get here's a blurb of information without having to write paragraphs and paragraphs. Like, so-and-so overheard this newscast.
Yeah, I always envision the HoloNet more as just the internet, that basically anyone puts any information up there. And there's certainly, whole news channels, essentially, sites that deliver the news. And so there's, HoloNet reporting. I think they basically, instead of calling it CNN, they call it HNN for the HoloNet news network. And I'm sure there's other news networks too.
Yeah, when you were talking about Amidala, it reminded me that I did recently read the Queen's Shadow books, but they do talk about, when Amidala like first joins the Senate, all the stories about her that are sort of like, oh, she's, royalty, she doesn't know what she's doing, she's a child out of her element, sort of thing. And then they even talk, I think, about trying to control the news cycle and get some like positive stories out there. So that's an example I hadn't thought of until you reminded me.
Yes, I read that book as well, and that really stuck out to me, as a journalist, because I can only imagine kind of the news coverage and thoughts surrounding her, well, then becoming Queen of Naboo at such a young age, and then transitioning to being a senator still very young. So I feel like, especially with Padme, there's probably a lot of news coverage of her career, of her storied career, essentially.
Right. Yeah. Someone back home, her dad back home, has like the clippings book or the, the hard drive of all the positive stories that came about her. And when we were talking about the exposition, the idea that this is sort of a trope, I really started thinking about how many movies use this, we're cutting scenes and we don't have time to show the whole scene. So we show the ZNN or whatever, CNN knockoff, newscast about something with some stock footage from a real war or something like that. And that's something that Star Wars never does that I can think of, at least when we're talking about the on-screen versions of it. But I'm wondering if like the opening scroll isn't sort of the equivalent of that. Like if they didn't do that opening scroll, they would have to give you that exposition somehow. So I'm trying to think for Solo and Rogue One that didn't have the opening scroll, if they had anything a little bit more, some other trick to give you that exposition, or you just know what's happening in those times.
The Clone Wars animated series basically does a newsreel version as their opening intro, that you have the voiceover, right, but it's the whole 1930s 1940s newsreel style.
On Coruscant today, the war continues. Yeah, no, I love that. I totally forgot about that. That's in every single episode. So there you go.
That's a great example. I didn't really think about it like that, because I just think of the Star Wars crawl. It's a very iconic film method, and to get people caught up with what's going on and kind of what they can expect and what part of the timeline they're kind of like jumping into. But yeah, thinking about not a crawl, but like almost like a previously on, but it's more of a newsreel style that you see in the Clone Wars animated series. And that's a really, really interesting way to think about that.
Yeah, because they don't specifically say, oh, this guy is giving a news report, but something in his tone certainly gives you that memory of it before you go to movies in the 19 dickety whatever, sort of news blurbs. I like that, James. I'm glad you remembered that.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the reasons we don't really see that angle in the original trilogy is, at the time, that this was all based on stuff that George Lucas had grown up with Westerns and 1930s, 40s pulp serials, samurai stories. And those, didn't have a media presence, and somebody likened the idea of Star Wars is the stuff that people in the 1940s would understand, that it may not be their level of technology, but they get the idea of it. And possibly a 24-hour news cycle might not have been something people in the 1940s had ever considered.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, just based on looking at what types of media and culture and kind of history that George Lucas was inspired by to create Star Wars, and especially kind of that pulpiness and the, kind of that Japanese culture and history influence that we're now seeing more of when we're going to get Star Wars Visions and the Ronin novel and things like that. So yeah, it's not that it's a bad thing that there's not a news cycle element in Star Wars, and there's at least plenty of examples of that, even if it's not a specific journalist as kind of a main character. You have the importance of like the dissemination of information and communication, and also just like the recording of history. And Star Wars does show how important that is to keep, protect history and kind of protect information, or else you can have something like the Empire come along and basically erase huge chunks of the galaxy's history.
Yeah, I mean, that, not exactly related to that, but it's just mind-boggling to me that over whatever one generation, no one's heard of Jedi, or no one knows of Jedi, when they were, that you go back and you watch the prequels, you're like, but they're everywhere. How do you not know this 30 years later? So maybe that in itself shows that there really isn't a lot of historical recordings going on. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a myth, one generation later.
I think I saw somewhere that there was some like 10,000 Jedi at the time of the prequel movies. And then you have about 2 decades later, people think of Jedi as this, they were kind of a myth, this kind of mystical religious entity. And they're like, oh, I've never met a Jedi. It's like, really? How have you not? There are so many of them and all around the galaxy. And so it is mind-boggling to try to wrap your head around how someone could not know one, or not know what they are.
Right. Or not believe that it would not have seen video footage of it, or, something like that, at least, even if you've never seen one. I've never seen Tibetan monks, but I know they exist. I believe they exist.
It is a big jump that not only are they in the halls of power and you see them at the forefront of the Clone Wars, that they're in the newsreels, that, when there's an active erasure of them from the history, it's like, I can imagine there's people who remember the Jedi, but they know if they talk about it, they're going to disappear in the night. So, what do you think that role is of, recording history, but doing it in a way that keeps you alive?
Right. I mean, and honestly, being a journalist and recording history, they go hand in hand, and both can be very dangerous jobs, especially if you're very passionate about that. And thinking about how, and it wasn't overnight, but, from our point of view, kind of watching movies and watching the television shows and things like that, is that it felt so sudden that now we have the Empire. We went from the Republic to the Empire, like the Jedi are gone. And it's not like everyone just forgot about what happened, but there was just this immediate kind of taboo and like level of secrecy that you don't share this information. You don't challenge the people who are in power now, because they have created this environment that is, it's fascism, so it's what they say goes, and you don't challenge that, and you don't try to bring back history that's actually real. It's facts, because they don't want that around anymore.
Yeah, it really says something about the Empire's war machine. They clearly had a branch of it that was revisionist history, or erasing history, that I'd never really thought of as being a factor before. You think of the Death Star and you think of the clone troopers and all those sorts of things, but they clearly also had a very effective team working on that.
Well, yeah. How do you hide something like the Death Star destroying Alderaan?
how can you? I like to kind of imagine if I was in the Star Wars universe as a journalist, how would I get that information? How would I hold the leading powers accountable? And you do see that in a different way with obviously the rebels and the resistance. There aren't journalists, but some of the things they do act like journalists. They actively want to uncover the secrets of the Empire or the First Order. They want to expose the wrongdoing. They want to expose the things that they're doing to hurt people, and they want to make it known to other people around the galaxy because they want to shine a light on it. And that's also a core of journalism. It's a core of being a journalist. And when I think about journalism in Star Wars too, like, how are the everyday people of the galaxy having their voices heard? What does voter turnout look like? If that's a thing when we're talking about electing representatives to a republic. So how do people who are casting their votes get to know these essentially larger than life representatives who are representing whole planets or systems, things like that? And I really like to imagine kind of this what if scenario of, what if there was just like a team of really good investigative reporters during the time of the prequel films. And instead of the Jedi uncovering this kind of growing darkness and the Sith presence, what if it was just like a bunch of investigative reporters who like doggedly covered Palpatine and uncovered this, his Sith alter ego and his plans to kind of destroy the Order and install this empire. And then they kind of took him down. Like, that seems like a very almost like spotlight level story in Star Wars. I want a Star Wars spotlight equivalent.
Yeah, that would definitely win the Pulitzer that year, I feel like, that team.
I would feel like that team would disappear before their story hit the headlines, that Palpatine has got his fingers in everything, and which is unfortunate, but it seems like that's how he operates, that, he makes sure that he's not exposed. And, the Sith have been hiding for millennia. They've been off the radar and, dismissed as myth. And I'm sure part of that is making sure nobody finds out about them and what they're up to.
The Rise of the Resistance book that I read, that happens between Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, where they're talking about the First Order, in that case, disappearing all of these different people who were speaking out or acting out or, stirring the pot sort of thing. And so you can imagine that the Empire would do something, or long before the Empire even was out, working behind the scenes, that's something that they would do. And I remember it really coming through, jumping around timelines with all of this, but it really coming through for me when I saw Rogue One. And there's a scene where Jyn Erso says, "Oh, the Empire flag or whatever, flies everywhere." And she was like, "It doesn't matter if you don't look up." And that sort of hit me, that like there were lots of people and whole planets probably that were just like, you know what, they'll kill us all or blow us up. So we might as well just head down, literally don't look up. And it doesn't quote unquote matter who's in charge. And that's something that the role of journalists really could have helped those people, I think.
Yeah, definitely journalism, journalists do end up the heroes that, they are, even in real life, that because they're bringing facts to light to the public and, getting information out about things that maybe other people don't want the information getting out about. And I think that is an important role of journalism in a free society.
Yeah, definitely. I'm teaching, a couple classes right now, of course, about kind of the role of journalists in society and kind of where we as journalists fit in. And while also trying not to make us part of the story or the subject of the story, we also want to give voice to people who may not have it or may not feel like they have a voice. And, they have a story to tell that to them, it may seem small or insignificant, or that it doesn't matter if they speak up, nothing's gonna happen. Or worst case scenario, something bad happens to them. A big role of a journalist too is to try to convince people who have those important stories to tell them to them, and make sure that these tragedies and atrocities and bad behavior doesn't continue.
So what are some other examples of journalists in the Star Wars universe? I know you mentioned The Rising Storm. That's a book I haven't quite gotten to read yet. But I'm definitely curious to hear more about that. Go on and spoil it for me. That's fine. I had my chance.
The kind of the details I have about the journalist in The Rising Storm is not too spoilery. So I tried to avoid because I didn't want to spoil the ending of that. But there actually is quite a few examples of journalists, and there's two that stick out to me a lot. So kind of beyond those two, and they're kind of throughout the Star Wars timeline. But one also that kind of surprised me was that apparently Hera Syndulla posed as a journalist in A New Dawn, the book. Mm-hmm. And I haven't read that one yet. And I was like, really? That's interesting. But then in kind of the sequel stories era, there's Sura Linda Javos, who's in the Poe Dameron comics. Yeah. And then there's he's a historian, but his name is Beaumont Kin, and he's played by Dominic Monaghan in The Rise of Skywalker. So
that's Charlie from Lost, or yes. One of the Hobbits. One of the Hobbits.
Mary. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Mary. I don't remember him having more than just like a couple lines in group scenes, but that's fleshed out more in the book version, or.
Yeah, so he really didn't have much screen time, but his backstory is, like you said, it's fleshed out a little more in the visual dictionary for The Rise of Skywalker. I think it came out after the film. But he has this really interesting backstory as kind of like a history nerd and someone who has at least some more journalistic training. So Beaumont Kin was supposed to be a kind of young history professor at this institute in the Hosnian system, but then the First Order destroyed the Hosnian system. So after that happened, he joined the Resistance, and he is supposedly an expert in kind of Old Republic Sith and Jedi history, which goes back, thousands of years. And he actually comes into play when Rey needs to decipher the Jedi texts that she saved from Octo. So that's really interesting. And I don't think that was really mentioned in the film, but it kind of goes into more detail in the visual dictionary. The visual dictionary, describes him as being fascinated by the lengths the Sith would go to stave off death, including the pillaging of worlds with any reputation in genetic sciences, which really stuck out to me because at the beginning of The Rise of Skywalker, one of the brief scenes that you see him in and hear him in is where he kind of posts this theory about how Emperor Palpatine might have survived and now is back.
That's great. I have that visual dictionary even. I'll have to read through it more thoroughly and then watch it again and get a little bit more insight into his character. Because for me, I was just annoyed at the introduction of his new character. I was like, these all could be lines that Rose is saying. Where's Rose? When I was watching The Rise of Skywalker. But if there's a little more to him, then maybe that'll make my rewatches more enjoyable. So,
certainly as a journalist and historian in the Resistance, it kind of blurs the line between him as a Resistance fighter and soldier to him keeping himself out of the story, simply observer and recorder, but he's also using his knowledge as a historian to help the Resistance by helping Rey. So he's not quite like an embedded reporter. He's more maybe Resistance fighter first, but using his knowledge as a historian, but also using a blaster.
I kind of consider him like a traveling archivist almost. So he brings this wealth of knowledge to the Resistance, obviously, wealth of knowledge about the history of the galaxy. And I would have liked to see a little more about him and his character, because if you have one person who has all of this history, and if you think about how the Empire has wiped out so much history, he's like a relic in himself. He's a treasure because he has all this knowledge that he's now trying to protect, but also share with the right people in order to kind of further the cause of the Resistance and to keep the New Republic intact.
Are there any other journalists or historians that stick out to you? We mentioned the Rising Storm. That's Rhil Dairo, I think, and her T9 cam droid. What do you like about her?
So when I think about Rhil Dairo, she's probably the most notable journalist character in Star Wars. And she actually plays more of a main character role in the Rising Storm because she was requested by, the High Republic Chancellor Lena So to cover the Republic Fair on Valo. She has a cam droid's T9. Her job kind of going in, I think it blurred at first it blurred a little more of the lines between marketing and promotional coverage, but she was the main journalist there. And notably, she ended up broadcasting live the just horrible Nihil attack on the fair. And it was, extremely well written. And there's a moment in the Rising Storm, and I honestly think it's like a whole chapter really from her perspective and point of view, where she has to get on the air moments after kind of subduing several Nihil alongside a Jedi who was helping her. They're trying to get communication systems back up, and she's trying to reach somebody to let them know that this attack is happening because the Nihil have basically cut off communication with the planet and the rest of the galaxy. She get the connection back up. She hears a GoNet is what her media outlet is called, the GoNet. Anchor kind of detailing the footage of just the carnage that happened on Valo, and her producer talking to her, asking her like, we're going to bring you in, it's going to be audio only, sounds good, things like that. And then she kind of sees what we call the lower third, or the CG, kind of at the bottom of the screen on a television report with breaking, Republic Fair hit by unprecedented Nihil attack. And once she sees that, once she hears the anchor kind of introduce her, she kind of freezes and starts choking up because the shock of it is now kind of hitting her that she's not just a bystander covering this, she was just part of it. And she says, I want people to see this. I want them to know what it's like. That scene, to me, I actually reread it yesterday and I still get kind of chills because it is so reflective of the feelings that journalists who cover traumatic events and huge breaking news stories feel when they have to do that. And I don't know if the author, Cavan Scott, has any experience as a journalist, but he really nailed it with the vibe of that scene.
That's cool. That's definitely a very different, very specific example in terms of, that's not necessarily her main job. It's not necessarily her beat. It's not like she knew there was going to be a disaster. I'm curious now too, if there's all the different levels. I guess we talked about it a little bit, all the different levels of reporting, are there fashion reporters on Coruscant talking about the latest gala and, all the way up through, the type of journalism you were just talking about.
Yeah, I think about, if I was a journalist in Star Wars, like what kind of stories would I want to cover? I think I would want the Jedi beat, just because the Jedi are they kind of go back and forth between almost like law enforcement and peacekeeping type entity and like a religious order, and I want to dig more into that. And yeah, they really do change over the Star Wars timeline. They end up being soldiers and generals, and it's like, okay, but they also have this more religious, spiritual element. So is that correct to kind of put them in that role? And I also want to know, like, are they taxpayer funded? What's their jurisdiction and authority in the galaxy? Like, why are they the ones that are more like law enforcement type level? And if they aren't supposed to be more law enforcement, peacekeeping type level, what is the equivalent of that in Star Wars? And if there isn't one, why are the Jedi kind of filling that role? Of course, I'd love to do more profile pieces on the Jedi too, kind of meet the Jedi, especially when you think about a time when there was, again, 10,000 plus Jedi, and there were Jedi temples on almost every major like planet and system with like certain Jedi stationed there. So I'd want to know kind of who those people are, who those Jedi are, and how they connect with the community there or the planet there.
Yeah, no, I love that idea. The 5 questions with a Jedi, same 5 questions every time and meet all 10,000. And then I'm picturing like the journalism staff writers getting cut way back when, the purge happens or whatever. You don't really need a Jedi beat writer anymore. And then you come out of retirement when you hear that Rey is in training or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you think that covering the Jedi, would that be easy? Like there'd be a lot of Jedi that would open up, or do you think that, they keep their level of secrecy and mystique a bit, or they kind of toe the Jedi Council party line on things so they don't get in trouble?
I think with certain Jedi, I feel like there would be certain Jedi who would like love the press. Because there's just like a wealth of different types of Jedi out there, ones who are more strict and kind of sticking to order rules, and ones who are kind of a little out there and they kind of toe the line between breaking the rules and things like that. So I think that there would definitely be some who would want to talk to the press and others who would like never talk to the press. I think it would also go back to what level of access are journalists on the Jedi beat going to get to the Jedi and the council? Because if in this world, if there is such a thing as like, okay, they're taxpayer funded, then it's like, okay, well, then it's, what is public record with the Jedi? Like our council records or the Jedi archives public record. I would love that for that to be a thing, because I would love to spend at least like a day in the Jedi archive. But yeah, like I would love to just kind of like dig into that as a journalist in Star Wars, of how this order came about. Why are they why are they on such a high level with the government? What's the relationship like with the government? And then, if you feel resistance to that information being put out and given, then kind of pushing back and being like, well, you have the, Galaxy's taxpayers funded you. So this is subject to public record, state statute, whatever you have, your Coruscant statute. So I would love to see that, honestly.
Yeah, I definitely picture getting Anakin Skywalker on like a certain day and just getting some seriously hot scoop. He would blab if you got him on the right day.
I feel like Anakin would like spill the beans of like everything. Yeah. I just get that vibe.
Yeah, he would love the camera. And I think he would be just a public relations nightmare for Mace Windu and Yoda.
Yes. Because you could ask him, I feel like a journalist on like the Jedi beat would have him like on like speed dial, be like, all right, hey, like, what do you think about this? And he would not miss a beat and he would tell you exactly how he feels about it. Like, I think this proposition that went forth in the Senate is stupid. Like he would say that.
Yeah, I'll bet that secret wedding and babies would have gotten figured out a lot quicker though under those circumstances.
Yes.
Yeah.
So many examples, good and bad. The Jedi, because Mace Windu wouldn't talk to anybody.
No.
Oh yeah, you wouldn't even ask. You'd be too intimidated.
And you'd go to interview Yoda, and we're like, we have to translate this for our viewers.
Yes, you're like, wait,
yeah, like closed caption.
Yeah.
Why so difficult it is to understand me?
Yeah, and I feel like Obi-Wan would just speak in kind of like philosophical sentences.
You'd have no answer. You'd be like, that's not anything like the question I asked you.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, from a certain point of view, it's like, oh, you again.
Yes.
Your lies.
Yes.
Well, we should probably start wrapping up. Is there any other examples of journalism that you want to talk about?
I mentioned it earlier about kind of the revelation in the novel Bloodline about Leia being related to Darth Vader. And then you kind of have a similar situation with, Rey, revealed to be related to the Emperor. I would have loved to be the journalist who kind of got the first scoop on those. I mean, I love them to death, and I would not want to write something more like tabloid or sensational type coverage, but I would love to kind of score the first interview with Leia or, with Rey after these secrets come out. It stuck out to me in Bloodline because as a reader and as someone who's watched all the movies, it was kind of hard to wrap my head around. Well, what do you mean people don't know that Leia is Darth Vader's daughter? Like, what do you mean? It didn't click. And then I'm like, oh yeah, the galaxy is huge and not everyone knows the things that, the Star Wars fans know.
And we see the repercussions of that revelation. It tanks Leia's political career. She's running for first senator, which is essentially like a chancellor position. And one of her rivals finds this information out and leaks it to the press, and it utterly destroys her career. Would you, as a fan of Leia, want to be the one that tanks her career?
Probably not. I don't think I'd want to be the first one. Her kind of rival for the Senate seat, if he shares that information, I feel like I would want to hop on it and kind of get her side like pretty quickly, or at least get his side pretty quickly. It makes me think of election season. I'm sure election season in Star Wars, the equivalent there would be just overwhelming and really, really interesting to cover, especially when you have someone like Leia, who, even though the galaxy is huge, like, she does have a reputation, she has history, and people do at least know her name in various ways, whether that's, princess, senator, general. She is a public figure. I would want to get her side and how she feels. I'd want to be kind of that, like, the first person to sit down and kind of talk with her, like a 60 Minutes interview.
Yeah, no, that's what I was going to say. I picture more like, TMZ breaks the news because they pay, right? Mm-hmm. And then, you go on Oprah or you sit down with Anderson Cooper and that they're going to ask you, some uncomfortable questions, but they're also going to get the full story and all of that. So that's definitely more what I picture your level of journalism. So I think that would work if you were in the Star Wars universe.
I can imagine somebody trying to track down Han and get his first take on it all, and Han not having the time of day for any journalist.
He'd be such a grump about it, wouldn't he? I love it.
He would just he would have like yes or no or like grunt answers, he'd be like, no, leave me alone. Like he would have that. But I feel like I feel like she definitely takes after her mom, with the politician aspect, but it doesn't feel cold. When you think about Padme and then also Leia as kind of politicians and people who genuinely care about the galaxy and about their communities, they are politicians and they want to kind of spread their message, but it never really seem like they're cold and uncaring. So she would have very good answers. Not Han, though.
Would you want to sit down with R2-D2 and have him spill everything?
Yes.
He is like a rolling museum of Star Wars knowledge, and I want to know his story. I want R2-D2's story, even though we've seen his story, but I would love from his point of view and his data banks that he has and how he survived this long.
He's my favorite.
He's great.
Well, if someone's interested in getting into your field, Chelsea, how would you recommend they go about doing that?
I'd say it depends on exactly what aspect of the field you want to go into. You don't necessarily need an advanced degree to be a journalist or a historian, but degrees can be minimal qualifications for certain jobs, like with teaching. So like I teach at a university now, so there's a minimal qualification for that. I personally have a bachelor's in journalism and a master's in history. Both of my degrees and my years of experience have obviously led to where I am now, which is, being an adjunct instructor of journalism and still being a freelance writer. With journalism and history, I think that being a motivated lifelong learner and just kind of endlessly curious are what I consider trademarks of both career paths. I have such a strong desire to know more and to kind of share that love of knowledge with people, in my professional life and my personal life. That also kind of defines my love for Star Wars. I want to keep knowing more. I want to keep reading more. And I think that having that curiosity and having that motivation to just keep learning as much as you can have really defined my career as like a journalist and a historian.
Well, where can people find you on social media, websites, or look up some of the articles that you've written?
I mainly use Twitter for kind of sharing my updates and stories, and that's at Chelsea Tatham. My website is chelseatzukowski.com. I also have an Instagram, and I just started like a bookstagram where I share a bunch of Star Wars books and things that I'm reading. You can find that again at Chelsea Tatham. With my work, you can find, my Star Wars stuff at Dork Side of the Force, and my other entertainment and local feature stuff at Supercluster and Looper, and also at our alt weekly Creative Loafing.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here and sharing your expertise with us. This was a really great conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
So that wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Chelsea Tatham Zukowski, and we want to thank all of you for listening, especially those of you who have connected with us on social media recently, especially at a rural farm boy who shouts us out every time we post a new episode. And also Matt from the podcast Yubcast, which is about animated Star Wars. He suggested we talk about microbiology as a topic coming up, so we'll put that on the schedule.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. That is Star Wars OLOGIES. No topic is off limits, even the taxation of trade routes and outline systems.
We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including Resilience Squadron and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. Also, check out the new YouTube show from Skywalking Network. It's called Today in Star Wars History. They are short daily videos with Star Wars history lessons. And if you liked this episode about journalism, also check out the link in the show notes to a fan film done by one of the Skywalking Through Neverland hosts called TPZ, a Star Wars fan film for fuzzballs who want to laugh it up. TMZ, basically, for the Star Wars universe. You can find all of those at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies when we discuss orthotics and limb replacements in Star Wars.